name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. There was an elderly man that lived out on a lake in a rural area. Didn't have much family. Lived there alone with his dog. But he did have a young friend, a guy that he had met earlier, and this young man decided he was going to go out and visit this older guy at his cabin and maybe do some fishing. So he got out there and late in the day, and the old man said, "Son, I'll make us up some steaks." So he grilled him some steaks, threw them on a plate, and handed the plate to this young man. And the kid kind of looked at the plate, and it, kind of like a film on the plate. And he said, "Are you sure this plate is clean?" And he said, "That's as clean as I can get it with cold water." So he ate the steak. Next morning they got up. He fixed him some scrambled eggs. That plate still had like a film on it. And he said, "Are you sure these plates are clean?" He said, "Son, that's as clean as I can get it with cold water. Just go ahead and eat." Well, they went out, they went fishing, they caught some fish, they came back, they were going to fry the fish up, have lunch, and this young man was going to go back to the city. So he fried up the fish, the old man fried up, and gave it to that young boy, and that young man looked at the plate, and there was still some egg kind of dried on the edge of the plate. And he said, are you sure these plates are... He said, "That's as clean as I can get it with cold water." So the kid went ahead, ate the fish, and he was getting ready to leave. He had his bag packed, had his fishing rod in his hand. He was heading to the front door, and the dog was there on the door, barking at him. So he said, "Hey, Walt, can you call this dog off? I can't get out the door." And Walt said, "Cold water, go over there and sit down." No one likes to do housework. I saw a cartoon on Facebook. It showed a dog licking dishes that were in the dishwasher, and it was called the pre-rinse cycle. No one likes to do housework. No one really wants to be a Martha. It would be nice if we could just see when the trash needed to be taken out. It would be nice when we knew the house needed to be vacuumed. Well, I guess that's my problem, not yours. Joyce has to tell me to do these things because I'm not observant about those things. Because people, usually men, don't really enjoy doing housework. And women, whether you like it or not, are kind of forced into the role to be a Martha. If it weren't for Marthas, we'd never have a potluck in the church. If it weren't for Marthas, the altar would never be set up, and the linens laundered, and the vessels washed out. That's an important job. And yet in this gospel story today, we hear that Jesus, who's arrived at his friends, Martha and Mary, Lazarus, their brother, is not mentioned in the story, but that the three of them were siblings living together. Martha was the oldest, apparently, because she was the one who welcomed Jesus when he got there. She may not have known he was coming. He couldn't text her outside the city saying, "I'll be there in 15 minutes. So when he got there, she had to scurry around and kind of clean things up. And Mary just sat at his feet. I had a church back in Brighton, Michigan, where I had another priest who was a member of that parish. He ran the camp, the Diocese of Michigan's camp, which was outside of Brighton. And that's where he and his wife went to church. And we had a cleanup day. You have them here too. And, we're cleaning up in the church, and I said to Paul's wife, I said, "Where's Paul?" And she said, "He's probably in the kitchen having a cup of coffee." He never helps on these things. He just organizes them. I learned from the master. This story really is not a story about Mary and Martha. It's a story about Martha and the problem she has because she feels she's doing all the work. And Mary is sitting there at the Lord's feet. And when she confronts Jesus, she says, Jesus, holy smokes, I'm doing all the work. Martha was distracted by her many tasks. Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me all the work? And what does he say? Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things, but there is need of only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part. Of course, Jesus could say that because he knew Martha was fixing dinner. This is a really very interesting story because the problem wasn't that Martha was doing the work. It was that she was complaining about doing the work. They both had their jobs, but she wasn't getting the attention that Mary was getting. So she was complaining. Now this story, this gospel story, stands in wonderful contrast to the gospel story of last week. Remember what the story was about last week? It was the story of the Good Samaritan. Now, I know that because I went to church last Sunday. Just so you know, I was on vacation and I went to church. And it was a story about the Good Samaritan. Now, that story stands in contrast to this one. See, the early church, and developing on into the Middle Ages, had this feeling that the contemplative life, being contemplative, was very important. And that's why we saw a lot of monasteries develop and a lot of convents where people would cloister themselves and they would spend their time in prayer. And they based that reasoning, the rationale for those, on this story that Jesus said Mary had the most important part. But Luke, and this story is found only in Luke's gospel, Luke places this story after the story of the Good Samaritan. Remember, guy had been beaten and robbed. Two people walked by him before the Good Samaritan stopped and helped him. One of the people that walked by was a priest. Certainly not an Episcopal priest. We would have won by. But a priest was a position where they did a lot of prayer. The priest was kind of like a Mary. But who does the Lord hold out as being the hero of this story? Martha. The Good Samaritan who went over and helped this guy. Got him to a hotel, paid for his hotel, made sure he was cared for. That's Martha work. And Jesus holds that story up to us as being an important part of our life. And yet we have right the very next scripture is a story of Mary and Martha. So we have to be careful by saying Mary has chosen the best part, because certainly the priest that walked by this man who had been beaten and robbed was not doing what Jesus thought he ought to be doing. So somehow we're called to be Mary and Martha together. But the difference is we're not supposed to complain about it. We're not supposed to complain and want recognition for the stuff that we do. Now I will tell you, in the church, one group that does an incredible job and really gets very little recognition for it is the Alder Guild. I mean, frankly, I can't tell you everybody who's on the Alder Guild of this church. But I know every Sunday that I serve, or if I do a Wednesday service, by magic, The chalice is out there. All the equipment that I need to do the service is out there. But unlike Martha, they don't complain that they don't get recognition. But without them, it would be hard to do a service. Boy, don't trust me to set up an altar. Now, this story is kind of in contrast to that passage from Amos, which I also think is a very, very interesting passage. Amos was a prophet who was from the southern kingdom. God sent him to the northern kingdom. He was from around Jerusalem. He was a trimmer of sycamore trees. And God sent him to the northern kingdom and said, I want you to go up there and prophesy. Already, strike one. That's like sending somebody from the University of Kansas down to Oklahoma to tell them about football. They're not going to be happy about that. Although it would be helpful if somebody from Oklahoma came up and talked to Kansas about it. Amos got up there and he had 4 visions, and the vision we have today is his 4th one, the bowl of summer fruit. And in this vision, he says something that is really very important for us to grasp. God has committed himself to these people. And yet these people are slowly turning their back on God. They've gotten wealthy. They're living the good life. As it says here near the beginning of this prophecy, they're saying, when will the new moon be over so we may sell grain, and the Sabbath so we may sell wheat? Because they couldn't sell it on the Sabbath. They didn't care about the Sabbath and keeping it holy. They wanted to sell their wheat. You know, let's get this day through so I can make some money. And the problem was they were so focused on making money that they practiced deceit with false balances, buying the poor for silver, and the needy for a pair of sandals, and selling the sweepings of the wheat. They were people who got wealth through conniving. Nothing wrong with being wealthy. It's just how you got there and what you do with it once you're there. See, there's nothing wrong with being a Martha or a Mary. It's just what you do with it when you are. Do you try to help people, or do you use people? Do you love people, or do you abuse people? How do you show the concern that you have for your fellow man? How do we as Christians reach out? Do we get what we've got by the disadvantage of others? If we're a Martha, do we complain about it? And if we're a Mary, do we brag about it? You know, that same church in Brighton, Michigan is the first church I was rector of. And there was a lady in that church named Ina Shannon. She was about that tall, played the organ, had been a member of that church forever. She taught school. She was retired. She looked really old. She told me once, she said, Larry, I've looked this old all my life, and there's an advantage to that because no one ever says you look older. She said to me one Sunday after a sermon, she said, you know, there's a saying I hope you remember because you preached about this. The hands that help are more holy than the hands that pray. The hands that help are more holy than the hands that pray. That was true in the time of Amos, and it was true in the time of Jesus, and it's true today. We all have a role to play. And the role that we play should not disadvantage others. It should help others. And when we play that role, we should not complain about it. We're all a little bit Mary. We're all a little bit Martha. And we're all a little bit greedy. But thankfully, as Paul wrote in Colossians, there's hope for us. Because no matter what we have been, we can always be better. And God will always forgive us if we come to him in faith and ask him in prayer and in our life of prayer to give us the strength to do the task that is placed before us. So I encourage you, if you're a Mary, try being a Martha. If you're a Martha, try being a Mary. But if you're a Christian, try being good. Amen.
Amen.